Go live and broadcast. It looks like we are now streaming live. So here we have it. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome everyone streaming through Facebook Live or on our Zoom session. I'm gonna start out the show with a little intro of a film put together by our friend Ramon Renazario with the North Latino Film Festival. I just need to share my screen, people. Technology. Here we go. Share the computer sound so y'all could hear.
Always on time. They were never late. They never spoke back when they were insulted. They worked. They never went on strike without permission. They never took days off that were not on the calendar. They worked 10 days a week and were only paid for 5. They worked, they worked, they work and they died. They died broke. They died owing. They died never knowing what the front entrance of the First National City Bank looks like. Juan, Miguel, Milagro, Olga, Manuel, all died yesterday, today, and will die again tomorrow, passing their milk collectors on to the next of kin. All die waiting for the Garden of Eden to open up again under its management. All die dreaming about America, waking them up in the middle of the night, screaming, Mira, mira, your name is on the winning lottery ticket for $100,000. All die hating the grocery store that sold them make-believe steak and bulletproof rice beans. All die dreaming, hating, and waiting. Dead Puerto Ricans who never knew they were Puerto Ricans, who never took a coffee break from the 10 Commandments to kill, kill, kill the landlords of their cracked skulls and communicate with their Latin souls. Juan, Miguel, Milagro, Olga, Manuel, from the nervous breakdown streets where the mice live like billionaires.
All right, people. So before I start the show, I want to share with everybody, I cannot take the dry crowd with these virtuals anymore. So I got my own hand clap now. So again, welcome everybody. My name is Yesenia Lopez, and I am the director of the New Jersey Hispanic Research and Information Center at the North Public Library, also known as the NJHRIC or the HRIC for short. So you're gonna hear me throughout the program, refer to both, you know what I'm talking about. If this is your first time joining the HRIC, I invite you all to learn about the La Sala Hispanoamericana's Spanish language book collection, our services, resources, and programs, the Puerto Rican Community Archive collection, which documents the Puerto Rican communities in New Jersey by collecting newspaper clippings, flyers, brochures, and so on from the community that it's documenting, and the Hispanic Reference Collection, which houses the Latino oral histories, which are first-person oral history account interviews of different Latinos throughout the state of New Jersey. And I invite you all to learn more about it by visiting us at www.mpl.org. Or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. It is a pleasure, of course, to welcome all of our guests, and I thank you all for being here this evening. I want to make sure and welcome our illustrious guest, Ernesto Diaz Guerrero. Ernesto is the chair of the Friends of the HRIC. And excuse me, Ernesto, the HRIC is an organization that has raised awareness and helped establish the HRIC. They've also fundraised and have donated almost $1 million to the library over the years. I'd like to invite Ernesto to give us some welcome words.
Thank you, Yesenia, and welcome everybody to this program. This is a very important time in our history, and as you know, we are living tumultuous times, and we're getting close to that important election in a few weeks. And this is why this kind of topic about civil rights is so important for all of us to understand, and the importance of our community to carry out the struggle of those people that we saw in the video from the 1960s, and that struggle continues until today. So I am the board president of Friends of the HRIC. What objective, of course, is to support the incredible work of Yesenia and other members of the community at the Newark Public Library. They have been collecting thousands of artifacts of Latino history in our community from New Jersey, from Newark, and from many areas, of course, where Latino have influenced our society. So we have 60 million Latinos in the United States, and there are hundreds of thousands of those Latinos in the state of New Jersey. That's why this kind of programs that we have at the library are important for all of us, and also important for academia. I am a teacher, and as a history teacher, I believe that it's so important that kids have access to those artifacts. And that's why I encourage all of the Latino and non-Latino people that are watching us today to support the library, to support the Friends of the HRIC, and to support all our community programs. So with that, I want to welcome the panelists, and we hope to have a great event tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Always great having you, and thank you for sharing a little bit about what we do, right, and how key it is, right, for our community to know these things and have these resources. And with that, I just want to make sure and share before we start our program some of our upcoming programs. Let me see if I could share my screen again. So here we go. Here we have it. So coming up, we have this Saturday, right? We started this program, Gente y Cuentos, at the library on Saturdays. Our first program was October 3rd, but it is ongoing through November 21st. And what it is not unlike a book club. You don't have to know how to read or even read a book ahead of time. It's a discussion about a book or short story that you hear read out loud. And let me tell you, at first I was a little apprehensive because I can read myself, and I really just wasn't interested in that. But as I participated, I realized what a difference it is to have a story read to you. You know, I mean, I'm 30 years old, and I don't remember ever having a story read to me. So having that story read to you, it really does sort of make a difference on how you interpret and understand the story, you know, of course, depending on who's reading it. And so what we do is we get together on Saturdays, we hear a story read out loud, and then we have a discussion followed by our moderator. A discussion that follows the program, and the discussion is moderated by Alma Concepcion. So if you want to join, please, I invite you all to register at the link on the screen. And then I need you all to join me this Saturday at 4 o'clock for Gente y Cuentos, but early in the morning on Saturday. Stay with me all day, people. We have an 11:30 program, and this is basically a listening to, again, this is out loud, you know, oral stories. This is a web series, a podcast, I'm sorry, about the Ventura twins. And the Ventura twins from Newark travel through time to witness, find, and remember Puerto Rico's true history. So you join me at 11:30 a.m. We get to listen to this podcast, and then it's followed by talk back with the producers, Mike Joaquino and Dania Ramos. And then come back at 4 o'clock on Saturday and join me for Gente y Cuentos. Again, Just like you catching us today, if you want to, you can log in through Zoom, or you could join us on Facebook Live. And then following our next Latino civil rights movements in the U.S. Program is this wonderful intergenerational conversation with Dolores Huerta. I'm really excited about this, people. This is going to be a conversation with the one of the founders of United Farm Workers, Dolores Huerta, and some of our younger activists, Neri Almosti and Juan Carlos Tello. This discussion is going to be moderated by Dr. Patricia Campos Medina. So, and as I was putting this program together, I heard that Dr. Patricia Campos Medina had happened to work with Dolores in a couple years back. So it's going to be a real treat to sit by and hear this discussion about, you know, any advice on being an activist, different experiences we've had, and so on. So stay tuned, stay with me, and enjoy these upcoming programs. There we go. You have it in the chat. We got some links to these. And let me see, where am I? So I also want to say that those programs that I shared and upcoming programs are all available on our YouTube page, the North Public Library's YouTube page. So you can see some of our past programs. Make sure you stay tuned. So on behalf of the HRIC, the North Public Library, we're honored to host this very timely and informational program, as Ernesto said. And I'm sure that you all agree that this is a critical time in American history and politics. And we should understand our power and our place within that, right? So with the civil unrest that began to take place in our neighborhoods in droves over the summer, along, you know, different states and heck, around the world, you know, we just knew that it was really important to shift this year's Latino celebrations focus on Latinx and civil rights. So with that, I have the absolute honor to introduce our keynote speaker. She is an organizer, a political commentator, and independent journalist. An Afro-Puerto Rican born and raised in the Bronx, New York, she's dedicated her life to organizing, scholarship, and activism. From Cornell to prisons, Rosa is one of her generation's leading scholars on the issues of Afro-Latinx identity. Rosa is the president and founder of Know Thyself Productions, which has produced 7 major community activism tours and consults on issues such as hip hop feminism, media justice, voter engagement among youth of color, third-party politics, United States political prisoners, and the right of Puerto Rico to become an independent nation free of United States colonial domination. She's a frequent guest on television, radio, and online media, as her opinions on critical current events are widely sought after. Her groundbreaking article, Who is Black?, published in 2001, was the catalyst for many discussions regarding Black political and cultural identity in the Latinx community. She's creator, I'm so sorry, I'm reading her bio. She is creator of PR on the Map, an independent, unapologetic Afro-Latinx centered media collective founded in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. She's currently completing her PhD at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Rosa was the first ever Afro-Latina woman to run for vice president of the United States in the 2008 on the Green Party ticket. She and her running mate, Cynthia McKinney, were to this date the only women of color in American history, on the ticket in American history. On January 8, 2018, Rosa and 6 other women of color organizers joined actresses from Hollywood as part of the Time's Up initiative and the Me Too movement. Rosa was the guest of Oscar winner Susan Sarandon and stated that evening, "We are human beings who deserve the right to dignity. whether we're working on a Hollywood set or working at Walmart, whether we're a mother in the South Bronx or a mother in Beverly Hills. So here we are. So we are here not only to walk the red carpet, we are here to work the red carpet and give voice to the many millions of women who are often marginalized. Now I'm gonna put my hands together with my little, and thank you and welcome, Rosa.
Thank you, Yesenia. Thank you to the New Jersey Hispanic Research and Information Center, as well as the Newark Public Library. I always love doing anything related to Brick City just because you have an amazing mayor, Ras Baraka, who has been one of my peers for over 25 years. So thank you. I know we also have Porta Rock that's gonna spit some rhymes, and I'm sure people have Q&A. So I'm gonna keep it to 20 minutes because really when we talk about movements, probably everybody on here is either an organizer or an activist or trying to find a space of how to do the work in this time that we're living in. Asada Shakur says, nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who were oppressing them. And Pedro Albizu Campos told us, if tyranny is law, revolution is order. My story begins in the South Bronx in 1972. I did not grow up in a movement household. I did not grow up understanding politics and studying history. I did have a great sense of pride as a Puerto Rican, but I knew nothing about the history of my people, mi gente, what happened to our nation. I did not know why we were US citizens. I did not know why we were a colony. I did not know of the freedom fighters for decades that were hunted, attacked, assassinated, sterilized, or incarcerated for fighting for Puerto Rico to be free. I had to go to college in upstate New York, where I reside now, Albany, New York specifically. I had to take Intro to Puerto Rican Studies, Intro to Chicano Studies, Black Studies, Feminist Studies, movement history, for me to begin to understand why I had not learned anything political or historical about not only Puerto Ricans, but African American, Native American, Asian, and other Afro-Latinx, Latino people. In my sophomore year, I went to two meetings. One, the Albany State University Black Alliance, ASUBA, and the other one, Fuerza Latina. When I entered the room for the Fuerza Latina meeting, the president at that time stated that if you didn't speak Spanish, you were not Latino enough. Now, I was raised only speaking Spanish until I moved to Westchester County at 8 years old, where I became bilingual. But when I walked into the doors of ASUBA, the first thing I saw on the wall said, if you are from any of these countries, you're an African descendant and you belong here. And Puerto Rico was on the map. So as Drake rhymes, I started from the bottom to get to the top. That top was beginning to know and understand who I truly was and begin to confront all the internalization of white being right, brown stick around, black get back. I had to truly begin to decolonize my mind. I had to read, I had to study, I had to go to meetings, I had to see speakers. I participated in hour-long debates at our main meetup spot, the campus center. That time was an incredible time for people, especially in the State University of New York system. All our campuses were active with very active Black student organizations, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Haitian students, Pan-Caribbean associations, all on the 77 campuses throughout the state of New York. As a woman, I also had to root out the internalized patriarchy within me. I began to understand through my Black psychology class the trauma inflicted on me, but the trauma inflicted on my people. By the end of my sophomore year, I ran and became the first Puerto Rican woman president of the Albany State University Black Alliance. That year, I also changed my major from political science to Africana studies. Many ask me to this day, why didn't you major in Latin American studies? because there was no room for Puerto Ricans in Latin American studies specifically. Latin American studies geopolitically does not talk about Puerto Rico, but in Africana studies and in Pan-African studies, I found my academic home. I continue to take classes, be part of meetings. I continue to be mentored by Black women professors like Professor Colia Clark, Professor Lois Owens, Dr. Vivian Verdell Gordon. It was that time at SUNY Albany that I transitioned from being another Puerto Rican from the Bronx and Westchester County. At that time, we were having active conversations, although we didn't call ourselves at that time Afro-Latino, Latina, or Latinx. There were many of us who were Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Panamanian who understood we were people of African descent. But I specifically also understood that I was a Black Puerto Rican. Without what SUNY Albany and Asuba, my peers, taught me, I would have never become an organizer, an independent journalist, a 2008 vice presidential candidate. I became fearless because what I learned fed my soul. I learned about the invasion of our respective homelands, like Puerto Rico, Panama, Jamaica, Somalia, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Colombia, and Hawaii. But I also learned of our resistance. It was in college that I read the words of Lolita Lebron, of Laura Whitehorn, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. It was in college that I listened to the words of Chuck D and Public Enemy, the Welfare Poets, Diggable Planets, Lauryn Hill, KRS-One, and Dead Prez. The more I learned, though, the angrier I got. And Dr. Gordon sat me down one day and said, you cannot live in that anger. You must use it as a personal transformation, and you must also understand the system of white supremacy. Through this personal transformation, I became a critical thinker, debater, and challenger to the white supremacist domination of our people. I never have looked back since. In 1993, that junior year, Dr. Maita Moreno Vega came to speak on our campus. Dr. Vega is the founder of the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diasporic Institute. To this day, she is the only Afro-Latina woman in the United States that created an institution that is almost 50 years old and lives and breathes on 125th Street. Until that evening, I had never heard the term Afro-Latina. I had just learned what it meant to be a person of African descent. See, even though I had grown up in the Bronx and Westchester County respectively, and completely embraced and understood that I was Puerto Rican, it was not until I got there and saw people like Dr. Vega that I began to know who I truly was. The year before, when I had joined the Albany State University Black Alliance, my consciousness was awakened. For me, it became clear that not only was I a person of African descent, but racially that I was Black. So I began to devour anything and everything I could, not only to learn the truth of who I was, but to confront the lies and anti-Blackness I have been told by my teachers and the television. Although I began to identify as an African descendant, it was not until I joined the Malcolm X grassroots movement in 2000 that I began to identify as Black. And to this day, identifying as a Black Puerto Rican is not easy for me. In too many movement spaces, particularly conscious gatherings and panels, I'm often confronted and accused of selling out as a Latina or trying to be Black. Without the mentorship of Maita and the late young Lord Richie Perez, as well as my comrades in the Malcolm X grassroots movement, I could not have navigated movement and personal spaces that sought to take away my Blackness. I have identified as a Black Puerto Rican woman since 2001. Although many, quote, Latinx people, especially younger ones, are now identifying as Afro-Latino, Latinx, I often wonder if it is easier to embrace cultural identification as opposed to embracing Blackness, not only as phenotype, but as a political signifier. When I was doing research for my master's thesis under the guidance of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University, Professor Turner sat me down and showed me a census of Puerto Rico in 1880. That census identified that 63% of the island's population were African descendant people. In fact, 20 years before that, the Spanish colonizer, the Spanish government, was paying Spanish people to stay there to whiten the race, better the race. Same thing happened at a whole different level, though, in the Dominican Republic. I cannot tell you how many times I have often been asked, why are you here? Why can't you just say you're Puerto Rican? Why do you always have to talk about being Black? You're really not a Black person. You're Matt Light. What many movement people, leaders, foot soldiers, and woke folks fail to understand is that in America, the binary of Black and white has always excluded not only us, but other Black people. One not only look at the media in 2017, one only turn on Telemundo and Univision to particularly see anti-Blackness playing out every day, even in 2020. Often dialogues around race, when people say racial dialogues, they mean particularly African-American and white Americans. Never are we as Black Latinx people represented, neither are Indigenous people, Asian people, Black Caribbean people, or African people. Despite the growing numbers of a growing racial consciousness of Afro-Latinx people, much of the prevailing discourse makes the assumption that we have to subscribe to the dominant racial paradigm. Much of the discussion happening is how much we are in numbers. Some say 55, some say 60 million. That in itself is problematic. All 60 million of us do not think alike, look alike, or want the same things politically. Going back to the late 19th century and early 20th century, Pan-Africanism signaled for the first time an explicit organized identification with Africa and African descendants, and more expansively of non-white people at a global level. With the United States occupation of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the ever-growing migration presence of both populations in New York and other northeastern cities, including Chicago and the Midwest, the central cultural concern of Puerto Ricans and Cubans at that time was their relationship and solidarity with African Americans, and more globally with an African diasporic world. The Pan-Africanist ideology most prominently, the Pan-Africanist ideology was embodied most prominently by Marcus Garvey, his wife Anna Garvey, Elaine Locke, one of the spearheaders, you could say, of the Harlem Renaissance movement, and Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, a Black Puerto Rican who took part in anti-Spanish liberation struggles. Schomburg, a collector and bibliophile of worldwide Africana experiences, contributed greatly to the burgeoning field of Black history. Schomburg lived his life on the color line. His direct knowledge and experience of racism, both in Latin America and the United States, his alliances with other prominent African-American historians like Carter G. Woodson, and his seminal work, The Negro Digs Up His Past. Arturo Schomburg was already breaking and making history. At the end of his life, he identified as a Black man in America. This is written for Black History Month. So as Black History Month ends, it's incumbent that we as Afro-Latinx people in the United States heed the words and the work of Frantz Fanon, who wrote extensively about decolonizing the mind. We have to think about our lands being colonized, but also that our minds have been colonized, which then calls for an internal and outward revolution. It is also necessary that movement organizers, organization, and those that fight for social justice affirm and acknowledge a new generation of unapologetic Black, Latino, Latina, Latinx young people who are taking their rightful place in the Black radical tradition. As one of my favorite groups, the Welfare Poets, said on their 2000 album, Project Blues, who we be, who I be, who we be. We be I, singular I. Now the essence of Los Africanos and that of Lo Indio run within me. So when you call me Spanish, all my purity seems to vanish because that is not who I be. So don't refer to me with words that blur the trueness to my identity, defining me by a colonizer's language, disregarding my family lineage, my ancestral heritage. Now I be the rhythm of the conga, played to an internal bomba, extending from Nigeria, from a culture called Yoruba. No one, as Vince Staples says, will stop my Blackness. It is who I be. We are living in a time of fascism. People don't want to say that's where we're at, but they only need to read the work of Joseph Stanley, a Harvard professor who talks about the five steps to fascism. And the fifth step to full-on fascism is law and order. And that's exactly what this criminal in the White House and his syndicate all over this country, the Republican administration particularly, are imposing on us. Right now, young people this summer took to the streets in unprecedented numbers. But unlike my folks and my peers of the hip hop generation, their movements are truly intersectional. These young movements will not allow for transphobia, homophobia. They do not subject themselves to the binary of man or woman or Black or white. But what they are doing is being part of a Black freedom struggle that continues in this country. Because as Black Lives Matter teaches us, when Black people are free, we will all be free. But young people right now are also dealing with a climate catastrophe, what we've done to the planet. We have seen not only the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, we've had over 5 earthquakes in Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria. In the last hurricane season before this one, islands around the Bahamas were literally wiped off the map. Young people carry this trauma with them wherever they go. Whether they're 5, 6, or 6, almost 16 like my daughter, they are fully aware of what is happening in this world and now are being faced with a global pandemic that none of us saw coming. When we see children in cages, they carry that with us. When I go to El Paso and see a mother making a diaper while her baby and her are in a detention center out of paper, that is criminal. When we see an ice raid in Mississippi, when the water is poisoned in Flint, when Standing Rock happens, we carry that with us. When we see Eric Garner, George Floyd being choked to death, when we see Trayvon Martin's killer walk out, when Troy Davis is executed, when Anthony Villarosa, who's working at his job, is shot by the sheriff's department in LA, when we carry that with us. We also carry the rebellions that we've seen over the past 5 years. Ferguson, Baltimore, Charlotte, Minneapolis, Rochester, and now all over California, particularly led by Chicano, Latino young people that are also losing their brothers and sisters to the deadly violence perpetuated by the Sheriff's Department, the LAPD, and the state of California against them. And now a global health pandemic, and now seeing that Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, for the most part, will not get justice, and most likely George Floyd and Daniel Perdue and Jacob Blake and so many will not get justice. But for those of us who want to abolish the state as we see it, abolish the criminal justice system, justice for us is not throwing a cop in jail, but accountability must happen or they will continue to kill us. Many of the cities we live under are still under federal decrees, dissent decrees, because of the violence of their departments. But the last 3 weeks has also brought out a story that has not been carried too much in the mainstream media. Dawn Wooten, an ICE officer in what we call concentration camps, quit and began to tell what is happening to women, mostly Central American women, in these ICE detention centers. Women are having hysterectomies, are being subjected to hysterectomies and being sterilized without their knowledge. But this also happened in Puerto Rico. From 1930 to the 1970s, 1/3 of the women in Puerto Rico were sterilized. Many were used for experimental for Johnson & Johnson, who was experimenting the IUD and birth control. See, to me, this is a methodical genocide. And we have to use language that calls it what it is. Because right now we are facing a white supremacist in office who is sending out dog whistles to his people, right? Not only do we know that they plan to kidnap the governor of Michigan, now they also plan to kidnap the governor of Virginia, which means they probably have plans to kidnap not only Democratic governors, but probably elected officials all over this country. But something that went unnoticed as well was 3 weeks ago when Trump said that Department of Education will begin to use the New York Times 6019 project in schools, removal of racial justice trainings in all federal agencies and now federal contractors. Some people have said to me, that's not happening to anybody I know. And my response is, it happened to me 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. I was set to give a 45-minute speech for an internal working group of the National Credit Union Administration, their Office of Women and Minority Affairs. I had worked with the Boricua sister for months on this. It was a 45-minute keynote about Black Latino identity, part of the Hispanic Heritage Month programming. The day I was set to give that keynote, I got a call from the deputy director of the National Credit Union Administration that told me, because my presentation had the words anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and racial capitalism, that my gig would not be canceled. I was not surprised at that, but I was surprised that people didn't understand what executive orders are. Executive orders, once established, can only be removed by judges. And what Trump and his administration want to do is start a commission called the 1776 Commission that will not talk about enslavement, indigenous people, the taking of the land, or the taking of the land of our southwestern part of the country that was Mexican and indigenous. And at a similar press conference a couple of days after that, he said he would not accept the results of the election. He is trying to jam through Amy Coney Barrett, who most likely will vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, overturn the Affordable Care Act, and to gut the entire Voting Rights Act. And one of the things I tell young people is that we have to just be truthful about the American project. Until America really, really, really apologizes for its original sin of enslavement and gives African Americans particularly reparations, this country will never be whole. Because the project begins with the kidnapping and enslavement of African people, the forced chattel slavery for over 400 years, the purposeful killing and extermination of indigenous people, and the taking of their land, the exploitation of Chinese migrant labor, the land grab from Mexicans, the denial of equality for women. Think about it. The founding fathers did not even want the women in their lives to be equal. So as a trained historian, I contextualize everything by looking at the past, understanding the present, and knowing. But I'm also an organizer, and I use my scholarship for that. We have to say that when they tell us everyone can't have healthcare, that they're lying. Not only could everyone in this country have healthcare, the idea that they would gut the ACA when it is Latinos and African Americans disproportionately dying or being affected by COVID is diabolical. The fact that Puerto Rico is still a colony and that the United States wants us to pay a debt, we have to now get in the streets as we've done before and say, not only do you need to cancel the debt, we will not pay a debt, and the United States owes reparations and decolonization to Puerto Rico and the people of Puerto Rico. And this takes sacrifice. And many of us are also dealing again with this global pandemic. We don't know what is going to happen day to day. We do know that when this election takes place, it will not be called on November 3rd. We do know that this president, if he loses, will not leave office, will not do a peaceful transition of power. We do know that if he loses, that white supremacists are preparing all over this country to use their weapons and literally kill us. And we cannot not have those conversations as thinking that this won't happen. Fannie Lou Hamer said, it sometimes feels like to tell the truth today is to run the risk of being killed. But if I fall, I will fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. I'm not backing off. My organizing has taken me through many highs and lows, from joining the Malcolm X grassroots movement to being part of the National Hip Hop Political Convention that took place in Newark 2003. That to me is one of my most favorite moments in organizing. We were all together that week and we told Ras Baraka, if anybody runs for mayor of Newark, it must be you. And we worked towards that. I was in Vieques on May 1st, 2003, when the US Navy finally left. And we all should remember that in the last 10 years, many of our political prisoners like Oscar Lopez Rivera, the Move 9, Jalil Muntekin have been freed, not because the state freed them, but because of people's struggles. I end with my thoughts of being in Puerto Rico 2 summers ago. I have never seen that many people in any protest in my life. What was so special about being in Puerto Rico to cover the final resignation of Jose Joe was to see an intergenerational movement, but to finally see Afro-Latinx, Afro-Boricuas, Afro-Puerto Rican, the feminist collective, non-gender conforming, trans, queer, young people, anarchists, elders, all there for one thing. Not only the removal of Jose Joe, but to begin to have another, be part of the freedom struggle to make sure that Puerto Rico one day will be free. And I do believe that. We have to believe that ourselves. And lastly, we have to stand with our other brothers and sisters who are immigrants or migrants. Because Puerto Ricans, like African Americans, have US citizenship, it gives us a little bit more room. But we're also aware of second-class citizenship. And if anything makes anyone doubt that we can win, we're not even supposed to be here in 2020 fighting back. Thank you for having me. Pa'lante, siempre pa'lante.
I gotta make sure we hear my hand clap. It doesn't want to play. Thanks, Rosa. I'm clapping for you though, for sure. Wow. As you were talking, I said, darn, how did she steal my history, man? You know, I had a presentation last Friday where I talked about the establishment of the HRIC, where, you know, what we are now and where we see ourselves, you know, the HRIC. And it just so happens that my own history, right, just is part of the HRIC history. So I always share how when I was growing up, excuse me, I didn't know anything about Puerto Rico, right? So I was born and raised here in New Jersey. I didn't know anything about Puerto Rico except that it wasn't a state. And the only reason I knew that was because, I don't know, a 7th, 8th grade teacher, or it probably was younger than that, but I remember clearly them asking, you know, how many states there are in Puerto Rico. And when I raised my hand, the teacher turned around and said, and Puerto Rico is not a state, right? Like she told me that before I even got to answer how many states there were. And that just always stuck with me because I of course had no idea what she was talking about, right? Hey, I'm from Camden. What are you talking about? Puerto Rico is not a state. But, you know, of course, that always stuck with me. And I reflect back and I'm like, wow, I never learned through all of my schooling why Puerto Rico wasn't a state. I never knew what a Commonwealth was, you know, so I always leave in telling people that I had to pay to learn about my own history, right? We had to pay to learn about people who look like us, we had to pay for that, and I think it's a shame, you know. And so I'm really glad that you're out here making that point and letting that be known, and why I'm involved in the work that I do to make sure that everyone knows their history, you know, to make sure that Latinos in New Jersey do not sit there wondering why Puerto Rico is not a state. So thanks for that, for sure. And on that note, right, I did want to ask, it wasn't that long ago that we were in school, but, you know, have you seen a change now in sort of out of college education, right? And in primary education, you know, have you seen a change in are students learning about their own history? Are students learning now about Latinidad and what that is?
No, I don't think in the Northeast. I mean, you can find some, well, first, like the Northeast is the most, the schools are the most segregated, right? Period, public schools. And for the most part, they've been a disaster, honestly, in terms of really relying on and feeding into the school to prison pipeline. So you could sometimes find some public schools that there'll be a specific teacher that will do it, you know, on the side, or they might have a club. But it's not written in the curriculum. Where in Los Angeles County and now the state of California, I was there for 1 year doing my postdoc at Cal State LA in the Pan-African Studies Department. They passed the first ever ethnic studies bill. So now 2 classes have to be taught, or students from 9 to 12 will have to take 2 ethnic studies classes. And then within the California public school, the public university system, they have to now take 4 classes. And in fact, I taught one of the first ones that came out of San Francisco State University last year online. And there was a lot of angry young white men who were like, why do I have to take this class, you know? And what I would tell them is like, I took 3 years of classes learning about white people, or like 20 years, you know? But Cali is part of their curriculum now. And it was because of struggle, you know? It's not because, and Cali, the whole Board of Education is mostly Latino and African-American folks, you know, that think that we don't have a history to talk about, that think that learning Black or Puerto Rican Chicano studies is easy classes to take, you know, and that's not true, you know. So I don't see that in the Northeast unless, you know, you have your young person maybe going to like a magnet school, a Montessori, or some kind of private small school. Like my daughter here in Albany, New York, it's a school called the Free School. It was started in 1969. It follows the Montessori system, but it's also about how young people can learn by any means. So they wouldn't have like math class, but they would bake. And that's how they would learn measurements, right? They would, if there was a conflict in the school, nobody's getting kicked out, nobody's getting arrested by a cop, nobody's putting your hands, nobody's getting suspended. The entire school comes together to do some restorative justice and accountability, you know. And now she's in high school here in Albany, New York, virtual, but her and her friends last year started demanding more Black studies, especially around Black Lives Matter, because she has been part of Black Lives Matter and Me Too since we were in California.
Nice, thank you. So perfect segue, right? Let's talk about it. Black Lives Matter movement. Too many of us, and I know you know them, right, just feel like they cannot relate to the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, can you speak to us a little bit about how you see the Latinx role in the Black Lives Matter movement? What role do we play?
Yeah, I don't use Latinx or Hispanic. Like those are just terms I don't use. They don't really represent like the racial and our ethnic identity. But and I would push back a little on the Black Lives Matter thing, because there's mad Latinos in Black Lives Matter in all the chapters, and it looks very different, right? It depends. Like if you're in Chicago, and in New York City, and in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where there are large Puerto Rican, Cuban, and other immigrant populations, the solidarity with African Americans has always been there. I think the problematic thing right now is that first people are like, how can, well, I'm not Black. And I'm like, that shouldn't matter. Like whether however you racially identify, which is most likely wrong anyway, like Black people should not be getting choked and killed. But also there's as many Latino brothers and sisters, especially in the West Coast, that are being straight up murdered by the police, all mostly Latino officers killing Latino young people, and it doesn't hit the mainstream media, because in America, that binary of black and white, it literally means African American, European American, right? And mainstream media is bad at that. That's why I am an independent journalist. But also the last 5 years, because of Black Lives Matter, but also groups like Mi Gente that are, say they're pro-Black, Dream Defenders, that is literally all African American and Puerto Ricans in Florida, the Feminist Collective in Puerto Rico, what is happening in Loíza, Puerto Rico, what is happening with Dominicans and Garifuna people. That work's been going on for a long time. So for me, I'm like, that's an individual problem that somebody has. That means you need to check what you might be your anti-Blackness, but to also not allow people to use this narrative that they're using right now, that all of a sudden Latinos are anti-Black. That's bullshit, right? First of all, the whole world is anti-Black. You go to France right now, you tell me how African migrants are doing. You go to parts of Puerto Rico where Rosselló and them went and lived, and how did they treat people in Loíza or La Pela or in Carolina? You go to the Dominican Republic, there are hundreds of groups that are dealing with this. You look at Brazil, which has the largest population of Africans outside of the continent of Africa, and Bolsonaro, who is worse than Trump. You got 5 to 6 young Afro-Brazilians being murdered in Brazil every day. But you also have an assassination that happened against Marie Franco, who was an Afro-Brazilian, gay, sat on one of the, what we would say, city council, and was straight up assassinated by 2 of Bolsonaro's like basic hitmen, you know? So for me, I would say that when I got to LA and first joined BLM, there were some African-American brothers and sisters that were like, yo, no, you don't belong here. And because what it really is there has been friction for a long time, right, in LA with African-American and Mexican folks. But people don't understand the source of that friction. That source of the friction begins in the prison systems, where they literally pit. And for 2 years at Pelican Bay, they had these warrior gladiator fights that were taped by the CEOs that happened in the night, where they would literally tell African-American or Mexican incarcerated, mostly men, like, kill him or we're going to kill you. Fight him. We fight. So that comes out. But a newer generation in LA, there's a whole term now called Blaxican, where you also see how African-Americans and Mexicanos have intermarried. And you see Black Mexicanos. It's the same with us, I would gather, like in, you know, definitely Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, right? Where my husband's African-American. I have a Black Puerto Rican daughter. We've lived in the same communities and dealt with the same problems. And then I always tell people, just look at Chicago and what Fred Hampton did before he was assassinated in 1969. Fred Hampton, part of the Black Panther Party, the youngest head of the Illinois NAACP chapter, then, he joined the Black Panther Party. Fred Hampton was seen as such a threat to the state that he was assassinated along with Mark Clark on December 4th, 1969. Why was he seen that way? Because he began the Rainbow Coalition. And what happened specifically, Fred Hampton met Chacha Jimenez, who was that time the leader of the Young Lords gang. When Fred and Chacha met, Chacha would then transform the Young Lords gang into the Young Lords Party. And in fact, Chacha was the last one to see Fred alive. And for the last 3 years, I've been working as a consultant with Ryan Coogler, Charles Keene, and Shaka Keene, and Fred Hampton Jr., who never met his dad because his mother was 8 months pregnant and somehow survived that house being shot at 117 times. A new movie called Judas and the Black Messiah, based on the life of Fred Hampton. But when we were on the set, Cha-Cha was on the set. So what made me really excited about a movie like this, it's not a biopic, it's not a documentary, but it's for the first time ever where you specifically see solidarity on the screen, African-American, the Young Lords Party and the Brown Berets. And I'm like, just seeing that is so important and can launch so many conversations. And I think too, I think somebody might've said Black Lives means Black Lives Matter too. I'm not sure. Yeah, I was just, yeah. You know, so for me, I think we have to be always pushing back on that narrative and really look. And actually, Newark is another perfect example of African-American Puerto Rican solidarity. I mean, like Ras Baraka and his family, and what Amiri Baraka did in his time in Newark before the rebellion, post the rebellion. There's a solidarity really of African-American and Latino folks that I don't think you see in many places, that also can garner some political interventions in these systems of oppression.
Yeah. The 60s, late 60s, Newark had the Black and Puerto Rican Coalition formed. And that was the organization that helped get the first Black mayor elected in the city of Newark, Mayor
and Chicago with Howard Washington. And for other people that aren't Puerto Rican, you know, I don't mean just to censor Puerto Ricans, because I think what's happening now too, as we look at immigration, is being in El Paso, right? And I think a lot of us know this, if those migrants who are walking months in deserts to get to some form of safety in Mexico out of Central America, if they were like white looking like my mom, there'd be no problem with immigration. The problem began when it began to be these brown, indigenous looking Central Americans, right? And all the race cards that were played around that. And to see the treatment of Hondurans and Nicaraguans that are clearly African or indigenous. When I was in El Paso and then we went to Juarez, what I wasn't realizing is that there's a Mexican elite that is also against these Central American brothers and sisters, right? And especially if they're young and gay, trans, and queer. So when we were there, there was this like Mexican elite organization saying the same thing Trump was saying about these Central American young people, mostly who have been forced to flee their homelands because of all the United States dirty wars, you know? And now this thing with the hysterectomies, right? Like, our 1/3 of our women in Puerto Rico were sterilized. The same doctor was then brought to Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, sterilized more Puerto Rican, Dominican, and African-American. And now we find out that they're doing sterilization and hysterectomies, not only on the Central American, mostly Central American women in ICE. There's now things coming out about what African immigrant women were also being told the same thing. Like, I just need to check to make sure you're right. They wake up and they've had a hysterectomy or sterilized, and they get a piece of paper, basically like, this is the procedure you asked for. When all they went in was, can I have like some Tylenol, on my menstrual cycle, or I'm having some pain. You know, this is like, in 2020. So I don't want to censor just Puerto Ricans, because that's really never been the case in terms of solidarity amongst our people. And I do acknowledge that there's always inter-ethnic conflict, right? Like, that's just like, yes, old school, you know, old school people like my dad might not have gone along with old school Dominicans, you know, and maybe there's problems with like Cubans and Puerto Ricans in Florida. All that stuff is inter-ethnic. But what we really have to understand is, do we have the power to oppress other people systematic? No, we don't. Doesn't mean that we don't confront it the minute we see it, especially in our homes and in our block and in our families, because it's real. It's real. But that conversation too is colorism. And that's a very different conversation than, like, at the end, white supremacy loves to divide and conquer and make us think that our racial or ethnic difference is what puts us apart, as opposed to say, maybe it brings us together. But then lastly, I don't just get down with Puerto Ricans because they're Boricuas. Like, yo, you talking about statehood? I'm not down with you. Wanda Vasquez is a disaster. Jose Joe is a disaster. There's a lot of old school white men, Puerto Rican, that still traffic and sexism and homophobia. They don't want us there at the table. Like, we confront that, you know, and we do confront it. But the reality is that just because you're a Boricua doesn't mean I'm going to get down with you politically. And I think that's the main problem when people are talking about us being 60 million what? There are a lot of, like, Latinos in the Southwest that are like Trump hardcore supporters, okay? For real. There's a certain group of old school Cubans and Venezuelans in Florida that are now being displaced electorally by the 500,000 Puerto Ricans that have migrated post Hurricane Maria. And I'm like, I don't just get down with someone because you, like, rock the Puerto Rican flag. What are your politics? And if your politics are statehood and not wanting to identify with your African indigenous self, but particularly if your politics is statehood, like, I don't really care that you're Boricua. I'm not down with you. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're voting for Trump, or like some cousins in my family I had to cut off because, you know, they're so proud to be Puerto Rican and something else, and then rolling up to, like, our crib with a Confederate flag. I'm like, yeah, you ain't coming up in the house, dude. Like, decolonize your mind, and then we might have that conversation. Because I refuse to put my daughter through that. Refuse. Like, so for me, it's like my politics really guide who I roll with, you know?
Right, right. So Rosa, on that note, right, I hear you say, you brought up the sterilization now of Central Americans. You said Central South Americans. Of course, we already know that this is history repeating itself. You ran off a nice long list of injustices and people dying, you know, for unjustly by the police. This is not a new phenomenon, right? This is something that's been happening for decades, right? How do we change this history? And I know that's a long one, right? So how do we get our young folk to help change that history?
Well, they are. I mean, you know, I'm an organizer, so I see it every day. I see young people, I see organizations, I see movements, you know. What's happening right now, though, specifically, we have to be very clear that just like in the 60s, post the civil rights movement into the Black and Brown power era after 1968, the counterintelligence program literally assassinates or incarcerates our freedom fighters. Oscar Lopez Rivera was in jail for almost 40 years. Jalil Muntekin went to jail at 22 and has been released last week at the age of 72. Leonard Peltier is in prison. Move 9 is in prison. At one time, we had 12 Puerto Ricans in prison. They assassinated, you know, people from the FALN, from los machateros, the independistas in Puerto Rico. It's the same thing happening all over. Right now, Colombia has murdered, the state has murdered the most Afro-Indigenous leaders in the entire decade in just in 1 year. All of that being said, there's always a resistance, right? It may not look like how we want it to look, but it's this way because we didn't pass it down. At least I believe in my, like, the hip hop generation. I'm in my 40s, about to be 50. Like, I think we did a lot of good work, but what we didn't do right is to also show young people that nonprofits are not going to solve the problem. Voting does not solve the problem. Is voting important? Of course. It's one part of that arsenal. But what's happening right now that should be bringing us together is that there are literally white supremacists about to go and target practice on all of us throughout this country. They are making it clear It has never been clearer than maybe the lynching era in this country. These white supremacists are ready, and they are organized, and they are weaponized. They're weaponized by the president, but they're also weaponized by arms. And what a lot of them are doing is infiltrating the protests all this summer. That's what they did. Or they dress up and look like police officers, right? So I think what we need to do is also tell young people that property is not more important than life. I know there are older people who've seen rebellions, and we were probably in college at the time in 1992 when LA rebelled for a week. Do I want something to burn down? Maybe not, but listen, if you're putting property over people's lives, that's already problematic. The other problem too is that we have the most elected officials ever, and our conditions have literally not changed monetarily or materially, right? A perfect example is, and because the young people have been pointed out, in Rochester, New York, probably everybody might have seen what happened to this young man, or he was in the 40s, Daniel Perdue. They put a spit mask and basically he suffocated in the streets of Rochester. The entire city government covered it up, and the entire city government is African-American Latino. Right. So there's always been this thing where you're like, well, the mayor is white, the police chief is white, that's not the case. So Rochester, everybody running the city is Black and brown, and they covered up the murder of Daniel Perdue. The attorney general in New York here, Letitia James, when Jalil Muntekin was granted parole, she said, which she has the right to do, but they usually never do it. She was like, no, he can't get paroled. I'm keeping him in. And I remember I was on a panel and somebody asked me, and I said, how does she think she got her job? Because of the sacrifice of people like the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, the American Indian Movement, the Weather Underground. But that's what's being repeated right now. Organizers are being arrested. They're being brutalized. In Portland, they're being disappeared for 10 days. We have a president who has told the military, go in as much as you can. You know, and we have, and this is really post-Ferguson to now, these young people are also being followed by drones. And an example of this is in Louisville, Kentucky, where Tamika Mallory and Linda Sassour and their organization Until Freedom have drones following them 24/7 in the city of Louisville as they continue to fight for justice for Breonna Taylor. So what I tell people my age is, don't assume young people aren't doing anything, but understand that our movements have always been destroyed by counterintelligence. And that is real. And the only way you can guard against that is making sure you have a tight crew that doesn't depend on social media, because all of this is tracking everything we do now. Right? We knew it, but you can't go to a protest with a phone and then think the police aren't gonna pick you up and try to disappear you. That's something we have to figure out. But I'm proud of all these young people, you know, and I'm finally happy to see that the white young people in this movement are doing basically what they've been asked to do: confront their privilege, confront it in their house, put their bodies on the line, but follow Black and brown leadership. Same thing with brothers. A lot of men right now are like, I feel my manhood's been taken away. I just, you know, I want to be on the mic. Dude, you've been on the mic for 40 years now. Okay, like, give up the mic. Give up the mic. As a heteronormative woman, I have to give up the mic for my trans and queer people, because my heteronormative self has been on the mic probably too long. But these are hard things to do. But our generation has to do it because the young people are demanding it. And if you're not rolling with that intersectionality of identity, they're going to be straight, be like, you could get out. That's not how we're trying to run this movement, you know.
True. So we have a question from Hector Perez. You met him. He's one of our Friends of HRIC members. And he says, what words of hope would you give to our brothers and sisters throughout Latin America who are fighting for their human rights in various counties throughout the hemisphere?
Yeah, I would flip that. They give me hope. I mean, Latin America, Africa, Europe, wherever we are, the movement looks way more advanced. I mean, like, you know, within weeks of all the protests, Black Lives Matter for the first time got really co-opted by corporations. Like the fact that Jeff Bezos is out here firing Black and Latino young men for organizing and then having the nerve to say Black Lives Matter. What's happening in Latin America, parts of Europe and the continent, they're way more advanced in their movement. Look at what's happening in Chile right now. Right now. In fact, follow my homie V Bravo on Instagram, who's down there, been down there for months. Chileans have been in the streets for over a year. And when you look at protests, no one is arguing like, well, we shouldn't chant about the police because they might get mad. No one's, you know, in the United States, a lot of the protest movement, some movement folks will work with the police to set the path. You're like, that's not a protest, that's a march. Like, that's being organized with the help of the police. You see what's happening in Chile right now? Yo, the state is coming hard at them and the people are coming harder. So for me, I look at news worldwide to be like, we are really low right now with the type of organizing that it requires to be free. You know, it's the reason why we're in the global pandemic and the numbers that we are too. There is no way Trump could have been president anywhere else and not have been taken out of power by now. That wouldn't happen anywhere else. But we literally have a fascist right now, and people like, we shouldn't chant bad things about the police. We should go high, or they go low, we go high. No, they go low, we fight harder. Like, you know, I am also honestly very, as a third party person who's always voted for a Green Party candidate, this was the first year I endorsed who I think should have been the nominee, Bernie Sanders. Because I'm telling you right now, I don't know what Biden and Harris are doing, but the young people I'm talking to, they're like, they're not coming in the hood. They're not talking to me. I'm not going online to vote. And I'm like, right now, like, we have to vote against fascism and understand that we're trying to reduce the harm. But I in no way could understand how these two candidates aren't leaning in to the people that are going to put them in power, Black women, period. And that's what you see in Latin America. All these movements in Latin America are either being led by women or non-gender conforming people. And here now, we can't even get like Senator Harris to say, no, man, lean into being a Black woman, dude. That's why you're gonna potentially win. That's why they're trying to repress the vote. And I don't understand it, because so many young people are just looking for something to say, all right, I'll spend 14 hours in line to vote, you know, and I there's too much talk about like shaming people who don't believe in the two-party system. Why would young people believe in a system that has gotten us here in 2020? Why? You know, what would make them want to be like, voting will affect change? Well, for now, we got to at least be like, yo, dude, either he goes out or we're not even prepared for what the next 4 years is going to look like. Either way, it's going to be a bad scenario. So I'm looking at other countries and seeing what they're doing. I'm looking at other movements that are using cooperative economics, mutual aid, like who feeds us, we feed us. Who takes care of us, we take care of us. After Hurricane Maria, I learned this at Katrina in 2005 when I covered. But after Hurricane Maria, what I found so, what's the word? Not hope. It was just like, I was like, we're going to be free in my lifetime. You know, anybody who's Puerto Rican maybe has had a conversation on the island with an elder who's like, we're only independent when the lights are off because of the repression of the Independentista Party. And a lot of elders would also be like, what would we do without America? Well, Hurricane Maria showed exactly what Puerto Ricans would do without government help. We got paper towels thrown at us. And what did we do? Young people have started farms. They're taking over empty schools. There's a feminist collective, a health collective, mutual aid. You get fed, but you also get fed in the mind. And that's what led to the ouster of Rosselló. what happened after Hurricane Maria, but also that the people were finding like, we could do this. We can join the international community. We don't need to be a colony. We're not paying your debt. Cancel the debt. Roll back promesa. Hitting up elected officials like Velasquez and Serrano, who voted and had Obama sign promesa that got Puerto Rico into the debt more. These are all the conversations as well. The Puerto Rican police are the worst police in the Western Hemisphere in terms of brutality and murder. And people don't realize that, but the people of Puerto Rico do. So being in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria was like, we don't need the US government, right? We don't need to rebuild an electrical grid. We could be the first island that uses renewable energy sources. We're an island. Okay, we don't need to rebuild a grid where there's been 2 corrupt deals made and another 200 million stolen from the people of Puerto Rico. So that to me is an example that's pretty close, you know, that can be like, one thing can shift your consciousness real fast. You could be like about statehood 2 days and then 2 days later be like, oh, no, we need to be free. Like this colonial domination must end here, and intervention of the military and all our other countries have to here. Let me see, can the purist ideology that you seem to espouse win over the critical purist ideology? Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't think I'm a purist ideology. That really talks more to like a conservative ideology, like Amy Coney Barrett and all the crazy Republicans. My ideology is the Puerto Rican nationalism, political nationalism, and the Black radical tradition. And I totally believe the masses can be won over, but that has to happen within a really hitting on capitalism right now and that racial capitalism. Because what is happening is in 2020, there's more people that look like us in quote, visible power. But yet we have the most income disparity ever in this country. So you have 40 families that control 72% of the wealth. We have to question, how are the billionaires able to be billionaires? How is Jeff Bezos going to be a trillionaire? By exploiting all your workers, exploiting people, exploiting land. But in this country, we're taught the more money you make, the more powerful you are, which is true in a way, because you might have the military might, but if the masses start rising up, and it's going to happen, you cannot have this many people unemployed, gut the ACA and turn Roe versus Wade. If they, you know, this is right now, people are breaking. So if my purist ideology is like to the masses, I would be like, yes. And the top of all this is that capitalism, the system of capitalism is the worst economic system ever created. A system that values 50 people over 340 million plus. That's crazy. That's insane. And you don't get to be a billionaire or trillionaire by not exploiting people, you know? And we have to begin to really, really question capitalism. That's what's being questioned in Latin America. Again, and that's the fear that Trump and them are like, oh, you don't want to be like socialist Venezuela. And I'm like, okay, show me a better example in America. How do we have like 1/3 of the people right now don't have food on a daily basis? How do we have young people homeless in our streets? Explain to me how much better the United States is around the human right of healthcare and clean drinking water. And then I might say, I'm wrong about my politics, but not right now. I'm not willing to concede right now.
And we wouldn't have you on here if you were. So,
or you, or anybody. True.
So listen, I would love to continue this conversation. What we got here?
I want to see Porta Rock rock.
I do. Thank you. Worldwide solidarity with all our marginalized brothers and sisters from Palestine and beyond. That's from our colleague Reggie Blanding. Yeah, when he heard I was bringing you on the show, he was definitely like, nah, she's dope, man. I can't wait to have you. So,
and Palestine, of course. I mean, if people can show how they exist, it's the Palestinian people. And I'll just end on this note. When I was in Ferguson, it was the first time that I had seen African-American Puerto Rican, Palestinians, Mexicans who were undocumented in this little town called Ferguson, 197 days of straight protests. And 6 years later, they still, as many can be on the streets, but also the attacks against them should be a real lesson right now, because the state came that hard that it pretty much destroyed a lot of people's lives in Ferguson. But with that said, we always have to look at the Palestinian struggle. That's the one thing that usually gets people in trouble in this country, and I don't know why, because they have a right to their land back and a right of return. So if I'm Puerto Rican and saying Puerto Rico needs to be independent, if you're African American saying African American needs reparations, then, you know, always support Palestinian brothers and sisters, because they always support us. So
surely, surely. So we had a following comment from our directors tuned in, Jocelyn Bolin Dixon. She says, that's very true. Usually not that type of solidarity, unfortunately, and there should be. So any last words, Rosa? How do we follow you? How do we keep in touch so we can keep this energy going and hear Porta Rock?
Yeah, no, I'm on social media. I'm based in Albany, New York. I've been finishing my dissertation around what I now call Black Latina identity, you know, and I'm always around, you know. I'm not in the streets this summer because of pre-existing health stuff, you know, but my daughter is. And I think my role right now is to keep always reminding people that we have a history of solidarity, that we're not meant to have survived or we have survived, but that our children want to do more than survive. They want to thrive. They are completely aware of what's happening. And I tell people who have children, they'll always ask me, when did you start to talk to Alicia about her being a Black Puerto Rican? I said, the day I gave birth to her. The day I gave birth to her, they brought in the paper and had already marked her identity as Hispanic. And I was like, no, you're gonna have to take that back. And my husband's like, you just had a baby. I'm like, no, this is where it starts. Like, this is where it starts. It starts on that piece of paper where someone is naming who she is. And I said, nah, they brought it back. They didn't have the category. Okay, other, ex, Black Puerto Rican. We don't know if we could accept that. I was like, I ain't leaving until you accept it and give me the social security number, you know? So from the day she's born to this moment, that girl knows she's a Black Puerto Rican. I think my parents would have done better if they knew our history. But now our relationship has grown and they tell me so many things, right? Because that I brought all this home and so excited when I was coming home from college. But to see my 16-year-old daughter take her place in the movement, people will go, isn't that dangerous? They kill 12-year-olds like Tamir Rice. The police brutalize 10, 9, 8-year-olds. I would be doing a disservice to my daughter if I didn't first raise her to be who she is, but also have her be part of movement. So what I say to everybody, we're her parents. She was not just born for us, but she's also a movement child. I wasn't one. I wanted her to be one, and she is. So, yeah.
Good for you. Keep it up.
Yeah, for sure.
So I got some comments there from the audience. You can see, I think Reggie commented again. Shout out to your mutual homegirl, Suhair Hamad.
Oh yeah, Suhair Hamad. That's everybody's mutual homegirl. One of the best poets ever. Period.
Thank you. So Porta Rock.
Yeah.
It's time to
listen to Porta Rock.
Let me see your face, man.
Because I haven't seen him in a long time.
There we go. So you're gonna close the show in the way that you do so well all the time, man. I want to hear you, but let me just read off for those of you those of us who don't know you, right? Porta Rock was born in the mean streets of Newark, New Jersey, also known as Brick City. He found his passion for writing at a young age. He earned a BA in English Literature in 2001 from the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico, and later an MA in Guidance and Counseling in 2004. He's a known writer, poet, and activist, using his talent to transmit lessons and messages of identity and social protest to the masses. He's been a speaker at various colleges and universities in both Puerto Rico and New Jersey, including many schools throughout the city in Newark. In 2019, Jadi was recognized by the Newark Municipal Council as Puerto Rican Poet of the Year and received a Senate citation commending his dedication, commitment, and willingness to help others in his community. He was named Essex County Counselor of the County in 2012 and proudly published his first book of poetry titled From In Between the Bricks I Rise, Reflections from a Porta Rock. Jadi is currently a school counselor at Eastside High School in Newark, serving the students of Newark since 2008 and resides in Nutley, New Jersey with his wife and 2 sons. And here to give us one of his awesome pieces, I'm sure, is Porta Rock. My aunt went down. You got the floor, Porta Rock.
Wepa.
Wepa.
So this piece is titled Boricua con África en mi esquina. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Good. I saw the connection kind of going. Yes, I am Boricua, a sofrito mix of cultures that represents a people whose blood comes from way back in the day. From the Arawak and Taino warriors to the kings and queens from Mother Africa, along with that of the murderous assassins known as the conquistadores. But even though I was born American, I was sure raised Boricua with Africa en mi esquina. I was taught that we come from a people whose history was born out of struggle and fight. And no matter the pain, suffering, and torture our people were made to endure, we are who we are. Just like the stars in the sky, we shine bright like no other. Our stories were pushed to the side as part of the master plans that was created by design, so that we would eventually starve out and die, never knowing the who, what, when, where, and why. There is so much to us, and no matter how much they try, there is much that can't be denied, that I am Boricua con África en mi esquina. Even though my complexion is that of the Spaniards, my body and heart is made up of tortured, battered souls, whose cries can be heard from the greater Antilles and South America to Ghana and Nigeria, because I am Boricua con África en mi esquina. Hey, but Porta Rock, you as white as a ghost. You could pass for a blanquito. Why identify with a Boricua or a Moreno? Because the land that my parents came from are the same ones that our ancestors worked and built. It is the earth that gold and sugar were stolen from, and the place where slaves and criollos revolted and stood up against the powers that be, which is why I am Boricua with Africa en mi esquina. Because to say one is Boricua does not only mean that you love rice and beans, but that you love everything that makes up who you are. From the salsa tan sabroso y caliente that gives us flavor down to the bomba y plena, whose drums invokes the spirits of our brothers and sisters who died for the liberation of Borinquen. See, when I say Boricua with Africa en mi esquina, I can't mention the Young Lords without the Black Panthers, Don Albizu Campos without Malcolm X, Filiberto Ojeda Rios without Marcus Garvey, Lolita Lebron without mentioning Angela Davis and Asada Shakur. To be Boricua is more than just waving a flag up in the air every second Sunday in June and screaming out, Yo soy Boricua, pa que tú lo sepas. It is to know your raíces, your roots. From Betances and the Grito de Lares, where free slaves along with Jíbaros fought side by side for the freedom of Puerto Rico, to the nationalist movement started by Don Albizu Campos to end colonialism on the island. Boricua con África en su esquina is to accept one another, whether blanquito, trigueño, moreno, negro. It is not only to mix our rice and beans with the cornbread and collard greens. It is to stand together when another Black or brown life is taken. It is to knock down the walls that have been built long ago to divide us in order to stop us. To be Boricua with Africa Mi Esquina is to raise our fists in the air against injustice in its every form while screaming Palante. To be Boricua with Africa and Mi Esquina is to know Piri Tomás, Julia de Burgos, Tato Laviera, Miguel Piñero, Pedro Pietri, and how beautiful it is to be Black and Puerto Riqueño in America really is. To be Boricua with Africa and Mi Esquina is to know Charlie Chase and Ruby D as the first Puerto Rock MCs. To be Boricua with Africa Mi Esquina is to know that Yemaya is the mother of all Orishas who protect many of us. To be Boricua with Africa Mi Esquina is to celebrate one another's accomplishments like no other. To be Boricua with Africa in tu esquina is to love yourself. Gracias. Y pa'lante, mi gente siempre.
Oh man, oh rocket man, thank you. Yeah, I see your boy in the background. I locked the door on mine, so it's all good.
I want to thank you, Yesenia, for coordinating this amazing event. The New Jersey Hispanic Research and Information Center and the North Public Library. Thank you so much. I want to thank Rosa Clemente, Palante Queen. Your work is amazing. It is necessary, especially today, not just for our Black and brown brothers and sisters, but for everyone. Thank you so much for spreading your knowledge and for doing what you do.
Thank you. And it's on Instagram Live now.
Nice. There you go.
Thank you for what you do. It's the artists that keep us going in these times.
Yeah.
Gracias. Thank you.
So Porta Rock, before I hit this end button, man, tell us también, maybe put it in the chat. How do we follow you? Where can we find you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Give me a quick sec. You can follow me on Facebook. I have an Instagram. I have a website. Let me see.
Porta Rock, www.portarock.com.
You heard that, right? Yeah,
That's your publicist. Woo!
My little man right there. Porta Rock.
Porta Rock.
Right there. Right. I said www.portarockwriter.com.
Nice. So people, thank you, man. Que seguimos pa'lante. You know, I hope you all tune into our programs is still to come. Yes, listen to the children, they say in the background. and we'll stay, we'll stay in touch. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you for sure, Porta Rock.
Thank you. Pa'lante, everybody. Stay safe.
Likewise. Thank you for tuning in, everyone.